All right, this is take two. Hopefully the internet won't crash in the middle of recording this mini lecture. Non-ideal theory and ways that we can try to implement emissions reductions targets. Let me scroll back to the beginning here because I got halfway through the lecture and then the internet crashed. Okay, so we're going to be talking both about how we can and about non-ideal theory, what happens when we try to apply moral standards in the real world, and also different policy proposals for actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So how are we actually going to implement these standards of justice in the real world? So what do I mean by non-ideal theory? Non-ideal theory has its roots in Rawlsian political philosophy, and this is based on the idea that when we move from the ideal world of a theory of justice, from the abstractions of the original position to the real world, that we face two potential problems. The first is non-compliance, and the second are unfavorable circumstances. And so we need to do some sort of non-ideal theory where we relax some of our assumptions and theoretical burdens in light of these challenges. So what do we mean by these? Partial or non-compliance is the fact that individuals or communities often fail to comply with their moral duties. I don't think I need to spend too much time explaining this, but people don't always act morally. This could be from a lack of motivation or ability, could be from a lack of knowledge, or more fundamentally, disagreement over what those moral duties obtain. And so how should we change both the content and as well as the demandingness of our moral duties in light of the fact that not everyone is going to act in accordance with these moral principles? So that's one problem of non-ideal theory. The second is what Rawls calls unfavorable circumstances, and that there are often in the real world material, social, and political circumstances that make it impossible to be just. There might be weak or non-existent institutions that you can't implement policies to actually realize these principles of justice. There could be extreme poverty that prevents people from acting in a just way. Uncertainty, whether there's empirical uncertainty over what's going to happen or moral uncertainty over what the right thing to do is. Or there could be technological constraints that you just can't produce enough food or energy or supplies for a community to distribute those things those goods in a just way. So here we have to again ask, should the duties of justice be relaxed or made lighter, maintained, or expanded and made more demanding in light of unfavorable circumstances? So let's look at a concrete example of non-compliance. Suppose that the US and the EU both pledge to reach net zero CO2 emissions by 2040. However, by 2030 it becomes clear that the US is only going to reduce its emissions in half, not to net zero. So what should the EU do? They have three options. They can maintain their burdens, keep doing the same thing, relax their burdens, follow suit, or try to take up extra burdens to make up the slack. Now, there are compelling reasons for and against each of these positions. Maintaining their existing emissions reduction targets could be justified because what other people do is irrelevant to one's moral duties. If you have a moral obligation as an individual to take a certain action, it doesn't matter that other people aren't taking that action, right? That the US is failing to act morally or act justly doesn't give an excuse for the EU to do so. However, we could also argue that one's own emissions reductions don't take place in a vacuum, that there's this phenomenon known as carbon leakage, wherein if you do not have kind of like all the countries of the world acting in a united fashion, that the emissions intensive industries will just simply move from states that are instituting emissions reductions policies to states that are not. So that actually doesn't do any good unless you have everyone on board. We might think that they should also reduce their emissions by half out of a concern of fairness, that it's unfair for them to take on extra burdens that other states are unwilling to do. However, there's some reasons why we might be skeptical of this position. Inaction by others actually makes the EU's actions more important. If we're concerned not just with an abstract conception of fairness, but with actually alleviating human suffering, then this provides that relaxing the burdens is even worse when other people fail to comply. Or we could argue that the EU should reduce their emissions faster or even more, because there are innocent third parties at stake. However, again, getting back to this question of fairness, like, is it fair to impose these additional burdens, especially on those who are already following the rules? So because there are compelling moral reasons for and each of these three options. We also could look at changing the content of burdens. That is, following Simon Caney in a chapter published in 2016, creates new duties, not just kind of expanding or relaxing our existing moral duties. These can be imposing sanctions for non-compliance, such as fines or penalties, fostering or maintaining norms of sustainability in our households and communities, lowering the cost of energy to incentivize people for renewables, increasing the cost of fossil fuels, again, to incentivize people to burn fewer fossil fuels, improving infrastructure in order to reduce the greenhouse gas intensity of infrastructure, or acts of civil disobedience to try to force governments and corporations to comply with standards of justice. So again, these are all going to create additional burdens on people who are already acting justly. But Caney's argument here is that we're not concerned with abstract fairness, but actually meeting the goals of justice, which are maintaining the rights of people to not suffer climate-related hazards, right? So this is going to create more demanding burdens on people who are already trying to do the right thing, but Caney argues that it's justified. What about unfavorable circumstances? Everything from the uncertainty over the exact trajectory of climate change, the lack of effective political institutions to enforce and maintain emissions reduction targets, to technological and economic limitations that make it hard for individuals, communities, or states to meet emissions reduction targets. So what should we do in response to these unfavorable circumstances? Well, we could maintain our normative standards, and even if we can't meet them, that these theories of justice at least give us guideposts for orienting action, even if we fail. We could revise our normative standards upwards and kind of use kind of what Caney talks about for non-compliance, but argue that there are additional burdens to alleviate these unfavorable circumstances, like building more effective political institutions, resolving technological and financial constraints on developing nations so that they can transition to more sustainable energy. Or we could say that we could revise our moral standards downwards, and that we actually need to make things easier for individuals and communities because of these extenuating circumstances. Or we can adopt a mix of all three, right? For some people, we might want to maintain more normative standards. We might want to revise normative standards upwards for those, and based on something like an ability to pay principle. For those who are the most fortunate, they might have extra duties, while we might want to revise our normative standards downwards for those who are less fortunate and relax those duties. So applying a mix of approaches based on individual circumstances is kind of the work of non-ideal theory. So how are we actually going to translate these abstract theory principles of justice into concrete proposals? Others, such as Aaron Maltais, argues that actually we should just abandon ideal theory altogether. That despite the direct relevance of climate justice literature for the practice of climate politics, there's good reasons to think that additional fine-tuning of general distributive principles is not the most pressing area for future research. That the goal of political theory, rather than trying to fine-tune and get a perfect theory of justice, should actually be trying to figure out what are the limitations and obstacles to effective action. What are actually the unfavorable circumstances? What are the things that are causing non-compliance? And focus there rather than focusing on figuring out exactly how to fine-tune our ideal theories. That non-ideal theory actually means that look, we've got these general guideposts in ideal theory. Now it's time to only look for what are the limitations and obstacles to future action. Now we're going to talk about some policy proposals that we can try to implement these principles of justice, but if you need to take a break, this is a good time to pause this this lecture, and come back to it when you can. So, how are we actually going to go about reducing emissions? On the one hand, we can think about the difference between personal and political action. Personal action is often not considered effective because of collective action problems, right? People can free ride on other people. But political regulation, so passing laws that increase regulations based on your reading from Roser and Seidel, these can better coordinate group behavior, lower information costs, alter incentive structures, and there's a range of political actions that can be taken. Everything from prohibition, standards, and sanctions, which are the most restrictive, basically prohibiting the use of fossil fuels or providing set quotas in the amount of fossil fuels use that everyone can use, to market-based solutions, which are less restrictive. And we're going to kind of survey in today's lecture different options that can be taken. Governments can also undertake PR campaigns and information campaigns to try to incentivize. Those are going to be the least restrictive, but also probably the least effective. So one option that often gets discussed for reducing limit is forms of population control. That even as emissions intensity decreases, right, as economies become more, and economic growth becomes more and more decoupled with greenhouse gas emissions, economic and population growth is still correlated with emissions growth. And we're going to accept, or I'm going to fiat that we accept, that coercive forms of population control are not just, but what about non-coercive forms of population control? This would be like strategies to alleviate poverty. There's strong evidence in development economics that as you alleviate poverty, you create incentive structures for women to enter and stay in the workforce, and people have less children as poverty becomes alleviated. There's also evidence that suggests that women's education and empowerment is going to allow for you to kind of non-coercively reduce population. Also, family planning education, giving people more empowerment over when and how frequently they have children, is going to help kind of manage population growth in a non-coercive way. But there is a lot of debate over whether or not these are justified, especially because often these techniques are targeted towards the developing world. That it is often the claim that people often make the argument that population control techniques, even these non-coercive forms of population control, are targeted towards the developing world, towards sub-Saharan Africa, towards South and East Asia. They are very rarely discussed in the context of Western Europe, North America. And so we should think very carefully about, like, even if they are non-coercive, are we actually applying population control efforts in a just manner? And we can also think about Parfit's repugnant conclusion. And is it actually bad to limit existence, the number of people that exist? And in Reasons and Persons, Parfit also discusses or writes that for any possible population of at least 10 billion people, all with a very high quality of life, there must be some larger imaginable population whose existence, if all other things are equal, would be better even though its members have lives barely worth living, right? And Parfit's raising this as a thought experiment, that, like, is it better to have fewer people with a higher quality of life versus less people more people with a lower quality of life? And this is based on the assumption, if we maintain the assumption that existence is preferable to non-existence, are we committed to this, what he calls the repugnant conclusion, that this world, Z, where we have billions and billions and billions and billions of people that are all living lives of abject misery, is that actually a better world than A? And if we can't justify that world, then maybe we can justify some forms of population control. But these are some of the questions we actually have to take seriously, both in the abstract questions, like what Parfit is talking about, but also in terms of distributive justice and who are we asking to reduce, who are we basically saying, whose populations are we calling on being controlled, and are we accidentally or on purpose invoking eugenics language here? Other efforts are based on technology, that we could use carbon-free energy, right? Things like solar, wind, geothermal, or carbon capture and sequestration. And we'll talk a little bit more about CCS technology when we talk about geoengineering. And basically all of the IPCC pathways that limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century involve technological advances that don't yet exist. That we need to kind of have technological advances in both energy production and in carbon removal if we want to have a chance at keep limiting the worst effects of global warming. So on the one hand, investing in technology seems like a no-brainer, right? We need to do this. This is going to be necessary for effective emissions reductions. However, many people have argued that this simply replicates flawed thinking. That this is part of the problem with climate change is that humanity believes that we have the ability to completely control and manipulate nature. And that rather than trying to enhance human technological power and capacity, what we really should be doing is trying to humble human power and live more simply. Don't need every other week. We don't need to have 2-day delivery for our goods. We don't need to constantly be driving. That we can live, that we can find joy and happiness and meaningful life, living more simple lives, less technologically advanced, and more in community with each other. There's also massive uncertainty with these technological projections. A lot of it is kind of a lot of the projections on the effectiveness of energy, not so much of sustainable energy, but of carbon capture and sequestration. So attempts to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere are provisional at best. We're still working on trying to figure out exactly what these are and how they would work. So a third strategy that Roser and Seidel discuss is limiting affluence. So reducing emissions through less consumption and lowering economic growth. And this was the kind of proposal that I was talking about just a second ago, that maybe our goal is to provide limits to growth, or what people have called since the 70s a steady state economy. That rather than thinking of the economy as something that constantly grows and constantly expands, right? That we always kind of hear that like we want a constant economic growth, that the economy is always growing. But this demand for constant economic growth actually means that we are having this low-grade thermal energy release, right? Rather what we want is a sustainable economic system in which all the waste products can be reused as inputs for our economy, and that if that means that we have to set limits to economic growth and limits to the rate of economic growth so that there isn't waste, so that we are not just kind of ejecting greenhouse gases as the waste products of our growing economy. However, there are critiques here. Can we do this without coercion, right? Can we actually enforce a limits to growth, limits to economic growth or a steady state economy without massive amounts of government coercion? Would this require a global authoritarian state to limit economic growth? And there's always going to be the distributive question. Who should live with less, and should those who are already impoverished, already vulnerable, be forced to make the same types of sacrifices as the already wealthy? The fourth strategy, and this one isn't really discussed in Roser and Seagull in much detail, are what are known as command and control regulations. And here's this is the traditional model of environmental regulation, where we set a standard of emissions. We might kind of, if we draw this graph, we might say imagine that these are different industries in a particular sector of the economy, and we might say that, like, look, the sustainable level of greenhouse gases for this industry is here, and everyone has to lower their amount of emissions below that standard, or they'll face regulatory sanctions, whether financial fines, penalties, or even jail time, right, if you make the laws strict enough. And again, the concerns here are that these are going to be both inefficient and coercive and hard to implement politically. So in response, many people have opted for what are known as market-based solutions. So here's a quick summary of what cap and trade, which is the most popular form of market-based solution, would look like in practice.
As the name suggests, a cap and trade system parts. The first part is the cap. The government sets a maximum amount of emissions. The second part is the trade. The government sells or issues permits to emitters of greenhouse gases, and every emitter needs a permit for every ton of GHGs that they emit. The trade part is that they can trade among themselves, and in that market for permits, price is established. Facing that carbon price, everyone has an incentive to reduce emissions. Let's look at an example. Imagine two companies. Let's call them Company A and Company B. Based on the market price of carbon, Company A and B determine what investments they can make that will reduce their emissions at a lower cost than paying the carbon price. They then must ensure their permits equal their remaining emissions. Company A identified many low-cost opportunities to reduce emissions. As a result, it has more permits. Company B, on the other hand, mostly has expensive options for reducing GHGs. As a result, it wants to buy additional permits. Trading benefits both companies. A sells its excess permits to B. What is the overall impact on the economy? All companies take actions that make sense for them. Collectively, their decisions satisfy the cap. Low-cost firms doing more emissions reductions. The high-cost firms, the overall impact get reduced.
So the logic behind emissions markets is that it doesn't matter where the emissions come from. That if you have 4 firms in an economy, right, you're looking at how does the economy's emissions levels reduce overall, even if that's unevenly distributed within the 4 firms in that economic sector. So it allows for different firms and individuals to reach cost-effective emissions reductions that reach the overall goal, because you're setting the overall goal at a sustainable level, and you're only issuing that many permits that would meet that level. So California has adopted a system recently, and it's been fairly effective. According to research done in 2017, the state of California became nearly $1 billion richer. Its latest auction of permits for its cap-and-trade program is the state's most successful ever. Their record-breaking sale, based on the heels in 2016 of the legislature expanding the cap-and-trade program for another 10 years through 2030. And this has meant that California is on its way of reducing its greenhouse gas emissions to 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. So this both makes money and is cost effective and effectively can reduce emissions by setting a market price for carbon that ultimately creates incentives for companies to reduce their emissions. So Routledge and Seidel survey a bunch of different arguments in favor and against this position. On the one hand, it's cost effective, because simply imposing limits would increase costs for firms and individuals to comply. It's non-coercive. You don't require a coercive regulation, but it empowers firms and individuals to make their own choices. However, on the other hand, it does imply a right to pollution. Should corporations and individuals who are polluting above a sustainable level, who are emitting more greenhouse gas emissions than the atmosphere can reasonably accept, why should they be rewarded or given an incentive for reducing their emissions rather than paying a fine for emitting too much? Additionally, many have criticized this, including people like Dale Jameson, for monetizing environmental values, and that once we have monetized environmental protection, that we've actually just created an incentive for disregarding the environment. And finally, others argue that we shouldn't be worried about the costs, that if we take climate change seriously as an existential threat to human well-being and human welfare, then we shouldn't be trying to make it easier. We shouldn't be worried about the cost faced by corporations and wealthy individuals, that we should be trying to fight climate change with everything we can, even if that imposes costs on industry and on wealthy individuals. So, next class, we're going to move from kind of the micro policy level and talk about global climate governance and reviewing a little bit of the history of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and as well as like what are the kind of prospects for the Paris Climate Accords, focusing on this evolution over time. And in your discussion thread for this class, how might principles of environmental and global justice help us make decisions over emissions reduction strategies? That is, like, how might the theories that we've been talking about help us choose between these different strategies that we've surveyed today? Do they eliminate or recommend particular strategies or policies? And as a reminder, in the post-lecture forum, everyone is responsible responding to any of the 3 posts for this week by Friday at midnight with a 200-word reply, and everyone must also reply to one of your peers' posts with a 100-word reply by Sunday at midnight. And you can reply to a peer's post on a topic that you didn't write your original post about. So you can kind of look, and I encourage you to read what your peers are writing, since this is going to simulate in-class discussion. So that's it for today on non-ideal theory and emissions reduction strategies. If you have any questions, shoot me an email, hop into the discussion section on Friday, join me in office hours, let me know if there's anything I can do to answer questions about content, make the content more clear for you, or help you all out, support you in any way during this period of social distancing and self-isolation. I hope you all are staying healthy and doing as well as you can under the circumstances, and I will see you next time.